bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Bryan Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 18 of Society and the State. This is Connor Boyack, joined by my co-host, Bryan Hyde. And today we're talking about something that any podcast, any show, any book, article, whatever, that has to do with liberty, freedom, etc., will inevitably touch on, because it is an argument that is in perpetuity. It is an abundant supply. People instinctively rely upon it who oppose what we're trying to do. And that is the argument of the social contract. Bryan, how many times would you estimate in your radio career did people that you interacted with fall back on this argument?
Oh, constantly. In fact, anytime you question anything about the way a certain policy is being proposed, or anything about a certain regulation or ordinance or law or something that we're living under, people will tell you it's a variance of, well, if you don't like it, leave the country. But most often it's a form of coercing people into saying, well, if you don't like it, you wouldn't live here. So since you live here, you must accept it.
So what's an example, right? So the social contract is what we're talking about today. For a lot of people, that's going to be a new term. Is it a social networking contract? Is this a social media contract? What is the social contract? And give us an example of where our listeners might have observed or heard it.
Okay. So the social contract can actually trace its roots back to philosophers that you might recognize. Guys like Hobbes, who was under the impression that government has to be all-powerful. Leviathan is what he called it, in order for it to be effective. Rousseau, who I think may have been the one who coined the phrase social contract. Even John Locke, from whom our own founders drew a lot of their inspiration, although Locke made a very strong clarification. There's something he pointed out, and he says, in order for it to be legitimate government power, there has to be consent. And so that's going to figure into what we talk about. But the idea is essentially that you have to live up to a certain set of conditions, whether you agreed to them or not, simply because a majority of people say that you have to. That, in its essence, is the social contract.
And so someone who might object to a given policy, let's say that I'm an Uber driver and I live in a city where the regulations heavily favor the incumbent and antiquated taxi industry. And I complain and woe is me, and I want to just be able to drive and earn a living, to which a taxi driver or a taxi driver's spouse or child or friend or neighbor defending the system that benefits this taxi driver, rather than arguing the merits of the protectionist policy and the regulation, would instead say, well, no, that's just a social contract. We've all agreed to live in a society that ensures that these taxis have a wage so that they can service people at 3 a.m. or who are handicapped. That's what our society has decided. So, and then at the end of it, if you don't like it, leave, I guess, right? Move somewhere else.
At its core essence, the social contract is essentially the theory that says, in order for us to live together, we all have to give up some freedoms. But it's most likely to be used in a case where you, Connor, are being asked to give up some of your freedoms so that someone else can have their way.
Yeah, when has the proponent of the social contract theory ever subjugated themselves on an issue that they didn't like to the social contract?
I don't think it happens.
How convenient, right? And so you pointed out when referencing John Locke, this idea of consent, right? So if I am King Connor of my domain and I claim that, the 100 miles around my house is my kingdom, and, oh, sorry, suckers, you've all signed this social contract that I conjured up out of thin air, or that I believe it to be today. Ask me tomorrow, it might change, but today this is the social contract. That doesn't require consent. That is, an imposition from the monarchy, from God, some might say. And so this is the implicit contract that you've all signed by living here, by affiliating with me, etc. But in our day, in this Lockean type of representative government, you include this concept of consent. And that becomes very interesting, especially when you look at the Declaration of Independence that outright says, in justifying their rebellion, their secession, and the war that followed, all hinges basically on this one phrase, and that is that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. They were seeking to delegitimize the monarchy. They were seeking to break ties with this government by showing that it did not have the consent of the colonists. And by then saying that it is an illegitimate government because just governments derive their powers, or I should say governments derive their just powers, is what it says, from the consent of the governed. So, Bryan, I'd love, because social contract, there's this whole, it's very abstract for people, but when you tie it to consent, everyone's signed a contract. Everyone's made an agreement. Everyone's given consent to things. Everyone's been intimate with a partner or a spouse. Everyone's gone to the grocery store. Everyone's engaged in economic transactions in which consent was a fundamental component. I think that's going to be easier for people to understand what we're talking about with social contract.
So let me walk it back just a couple of steps, and we'll talk about how consent is a magical thing that transforms all of those interactions. Essentially, when human beings deal with one another, we have one of two ways to get our goals accomplished. We can either do it by force or coercion, or we can get it through consent. But I'm going to quote a friend of ours, Rob Nielsen, blogged about this a couple of years ago. And he says, this is how consent gives legitimacy to human interactions. He says, consent is magical. It turns stealing into sharing, slavery into service, extortion into charity, exploitation into cooperation, and rape into loving intimacy.
Wow.
I mean, those are some pretty solid examples.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially, talking about the Declaration of Independence, what I like to do is to often use the Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary to kind of see the definitions and the usage of these words. And consent hasn't really changed, much like many other words. The definition is pretty much the same. But in the 1828 dictionary, here's how consent is defined. And again, if this is how the colonists are saying a government to be just, to be justified, to be legitimate, has to have the consent of the governed, then the entire legitimacy of the government hinges upon consent. And so it's really important to understand and also be able to rebut what consent is. So here's how in the 1828 dictionary it's defined. It says, and we'll link to this, by the way, they have an online dictionary. We'll link to this on societyandthestate.com/18, which is today's episode. Consent is agreement of the mind to what is proposed, accord, hence a yielding of the mind or will to that which is proposed. So you're agreeing to something, you're yielding your mind, you're subjugating yourself, you're submitting yourself to what is being proposed. That is consent. And that sounds almost like explicit consent. That doesn't really include, Bryan, it seems, implicit consent in that definition.
Yeah, implied consent is a very tricky tool, and sometimes you'll see this used. Those of you who sell for a living will probably be familiar with the assumptive close, and this is a case of implied consent. So let's say that you've been looking at a car on the car lot, and man, you really like it. You've shown some interest, and the salesman's got you feeling good, and hey, we can work this out. The financing is all in line, and I just need you to sign on the dotted line, or you're all ready to go. I'll tell you what, just initial a couple of papers here, and then maybe you get a voicemail or an email from him later in that day, and it says, hey, everything is lined up and ready to go. Unless I hear otherwise from you, we'll consider the deal done.
Oh, gosh.
And now, you laugh at it because it's like, man, that seems manipulative.
Shady.
And it is. But that's, you haven't given that explicit consent. There's only that implied consent. And at least you stand a chance of maybe backing out of the sale when someone's trying to strong-arm you like that. Government doesn't give you the option of saying, I don't want that.
And we'll talk about that, I imagine, perhaps towards the end as we talk about and analyze these concepts of consent a little more. Bryan, you pointed out we have explicit consent and implicit consent. Explicit consent is overt. It's proactive. It's just upfront and out there. Implicit consent is tacit. It's unstated. And what gets me, Bryan, is that we give explicit consent for so many things, including just minutia in our lives. You download, the software, and you say yes to I've read the terms and conditions, and I'll license the software this way. You go to the rock climb. I went to the rock climbing gym with my wife, and you have to step through all these disclaimers and yes, I agree, I waive my liability, et cetera, et cetera. You rent a car, and you've got all these provisions that you agree to, and read them carefully because you're yielding your mind, right? You're agreeing, you're consenting in the Webster definition of the term. And so for all these things in our lives, we require explicit consent. We're used to it. We're totally okay with it. Without thinking, we click, sign, right? Because that's our opportunity to either consent or to dissent and abstain. And you point out that the government doesn't really afford us that opportunity because, think of this, when it comes to stealing our property, or sending our children to kill and die in a war, regulating every aspect of our lives, suddenly explicit consent is too high a barrier, right? Implied consent is okay. For things that are far more severe, life-altering, life-ending than the minutia in our lives where explicit consent is the standard, when the risk goes up, when the severity goes up, the difficulty of consent is decreased by the government. They're oh yeah, no, implicit consent. But like if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter in Utah, right? Or if you're a conservative in San Francisco, or like if you find yourself living in an area where the government at every level implements and does things with which you completely disagree, not only do you not explicitly consent, but you don't even implicitly consent. And that's what I want to talk about with the social contract, because it's those scenarios where people say, oh, well, no, this is a social contract, so get out of here if you disagree. But where is that social contract written? I've never read it.
No one has, nor have they actually physically signed it. And I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on this podcast, but you'd have a very hard time enforcing a contract that a person has been forced into under duress or been deceived into. Contracts are supposed to be signed voluntarily and with your full knowledge and understanding of what you're getting into. The social contract is one of those malleable things, and it comes back to the exercise of political power, Connor, and this is one of the reasons you mentioned the Declaration of Independence. The founders distrusted the consolidation of power and the exercise of power without breaking it up, checking it, balancing it, and that's one of the reasons why they refer to legitimate government requires the consent of the governed.
And so as we analyze this implicit consent, what you find in arguments that you'll have with people is they'll have different flavors. The social contract theory, when you take someone to like, well, where have I consented? Where have we consented? They'll use different arguments. And let's step perhaps briefly through each of those to at least address and perhaps rebut some of what's brought up. So the first one, I think that's most common. Bryan, you brought this up earlier. If you don't like it, leave. And this is the argument that residency constitutes consent, right? If you're a conservative in San Francisco, if you're a progressive liberal in conservative Utah, because you've chosen to live there or remain there if you were born there, therefore you consent to the system. And Bryan, you've heard this response before. How do you respond to the argument that residency constitutes consent?
Roderick T. Long is a professor at Auburn, and he gave an illustration of why merely your presence somewhere does not constitute consent. And he gives the example of a person whose neighbor comes over and starts dumping trash into their front yard. He says if the person didn't immediately move away from that neighbor and take up residence elsewhere, could we honestly say that the act of dumping trash into their yard has become legitimate?
Right.
That's a good way to look at it. The ultimate question that we have to ask when anyone at any level of government starts making demands of us is, do they have a legitimate moral and legal authority to be doing this? And our friend Tom Woods actually has a really powerful example of what that might look like.
Let's link to that then at the show notes page today. I agree with you that tackling the residency argument requires, or I should say, the people who use this argument, they presuppose that the people making these demands of you have authority to be making the demands in the first place. So the example that I often use is if you find yourself living in a community where a gang comes in and claims that it's their territory, right? We're protecting you, so you got to pay up or whatever. Does that mean that you consent so long as you remain there? Maybe that house has been in your family for 4 generations, and these punk kids with guns come around and claim that it's their territory, right? You're not leaving. Like that means something to you. You're not going to uproot your life. You're going to try and deal with the gang. And so do you consent to what the gang is doing, provided that you remain there? Does a rape victim consent merely because he or she is in proximity to the aggressor? We would never dare to suggest that that's the case, that the person is inviting it or asking it to continue because they continue to show up to work.
Or because they once accepted an offer for a date with their rapist. And then at a later time, well, you did consent at one time, and therefore that can be construed as, ongoing consent in perpetuity.
Absolutely. If consent, according to Webster, is the yielding of the mind, you can change your mind, right? Okay, so we dealt with residency, right? No longer do we have to move to Somalia when someone suggests that
right.
if we don't like it, leave. All right, so we're good there. The next one that I hear often is that voting is consent, right? So If you don't like what's happening, well, too bad, because you have the opportunity to vote, or maybe you did vote. And so even if you're in the minority, even if you lost, you've given consent, implicit, or perhaps some might argue this is explicit consent. You've participated in the election, and therefore you've agreed to the process, and that constitutes your explicit consent. I would argue it's implicit, to whatever the outcome is. Bryan, how do you respond to, is voting consent?
That's kind of a tough one. And I only say this because I've had the discussion to vote or not to vote with people before. And I won't tell you not to vote, but I think that a person can make a case that your vote lends legitimacy to a system. And if that system is trying to fleece you, there are those who could say, well, if you don't believe in it, why did you participate in the system? But legitimacy is what it comes down to. Does a person have, or an organization or an institution, have legitimate authority? And a person's vote is an expression of their conscience. It's not the signing of a contract. It's not an oath that they say, I will, live this, up to this to my dying day. Like you say, they can change their mind. They may vote for a candidate in one election and vote against them in another.
And this is the absurd example that you can share, that obviously this is ad hominem or ad Hitlerum or whatever they call it, right? But if you had, in 2018, Hitler running against Donald Trump, for example, Donald Trump would likely win by a landslide. But does that constitute consent to abide by whatever Donald Trump wants to do through the executive branch and then some? Right? No, this is like the lesser of two evils, as it were. So often that argument is used in the reverse. But this is defensive voting, right? Many people who do not consent to the overall system, or certainly the outcome, think of our progressive friend in conservative Utah, they don't want to be governed by people who they ideologically disagree with, or, our conservative friend in San Francisco. They don't like the outcome that is inevitably going to happen in the area in which they live. But they find themselves trying to do what they can to defend against what could be worse. They're hoping to minimize the burden of the state. And you raise an interesting point, that participating in the process is the means by which the government claims it has consent, but then it becomes this chicken and the egg scenario, because as the Declaration of Independence says, just governments operate with powers from consent of the governed, but then how do you consent to a system in which you don't favor the ultimate outcome? That becomes an interesting kind of catch-22 or chicken and the egg scenario.
Yeah, you've got to understand the flow of political power. Where does it originate? Because if somebody's going to abuse power, I'm going to just go out on a limb and say more often than not it's going to be political power. Sure. I mean, you can abuse power in interpersonal relationships, but the most widespread examples we see are usually of a political nature. So it comes back to legitimacy. I want to give you Tom Wood's example, sure, which I think makes great sense of where legitimacy can be found. Let's say you move into a neighborhood, and as a new neighbor, suddenly, you have a visit from the guy next door, and he comes to you and he hands you a funny hat and says, "Welcome to the neighborhood. You have to wear this at all times." Now, you're in your own home, and he's telling you have to wear it in your home. You have to wear it, around the neighborhood. This is not something that was disclosed to you by the realtor. So he has no legitimate authority on your property, in your home, to tell you have to wear this funny hat. Now, on the other hand, if you go over to introduce yourself to him, and they're on the doorstep, he says, "Well, come on in, but before you do, I require all visitors to wear a funny hat." That's his property.
Sure.
And he has legitimate authority, however kooky you may think it is, to require that of whoever comes through his door. He doesn't have authority to come to you and tell you that you have to do it.
I was going to say, it's that kind of party, huh? That sounds like a
apparently so
interesting neighbor. To me, the issue with voting as consent is that if consent is a yielding of the mind, we cannot know the mind of people who are voting. All we know is what they've done, the ballot checkbox they marked, if that. Right now, we just have to trust the voting systems that they're completely accurate. But we have no way to determine the state of mind and whether that person has willingly agreed. I mean, if you put a gun to someone's head and says, pick an apple or an orange, you can see that they've picked an orange, but they haven't agreed. They've not willingly agreed. They've not yielded their mind. They're under duress, and they're trying to defend themselves.
I don't remember who said it, but one of the most radical yet truthful statements I've ever heard was, "A free man is he who lives under no law to which he has not freely consented." And, on its surface, people, go to Somalia where the lawless people are. No, think about that for a minute. A free man lives under no law to which he has not freely and voluntarily consented. I think a free man would understand that there are laws to which you do want to consent. There are laws which serve a protective function that protect your inalienable rights. But to just simply say, well, by virtue of the fact that you're here, you're consenting, that's where it gets to be a problem. If you don't have the option to say no, then you can't say that a person is freely consenting. And sadly, most instances of the social contract don't offer a person that option of declining. It's like a squeegee man coming up to wash your window, at the stoplight. The squeegee man will come and wash your window whether you want him to or not.
You've been served.
Yes, and if you don't pay him, he's going to shout mean things at you and shake his fist and be really upset. Government sometimes acts like a squeegee man, except it will get violent with you if you don't pay the fee that it demands, whether you wanted your windows washed or not.
So many free men, as you were referring to a moment ago, will strongly object to instances of injustice, or they will strongly dissent to something to which they object. But this raises the next argument that I want to bring up. We've talked about residency. We've talked about voting. Another argument I hear is that silence is consent, right? That's even been turned into a term. Like you'll see, silent. Like I use it every once in a while if I'm on a conference call and no one is speaking up, and silence is consent. Now
unless I hear otherwise.
Exactly. Same argument, right? Same case. And so the argument goes that, well, if you didn't like it, you should have spoken up. You have been afforded an opportunity. You could have gone to that city council meeting. You could have showed up to the legislative committee. But because you have been silent, that means you consent. Because you were in our representative democracy, you were provided a meaningful opportunity to dissent and to declare your view. So, Bryan, how do we deal with or dispense the argument that silence constitutes consent?
I would ask a person to consider how many people actually know all of the laws, all the regulations, all the ordinances under which they live. And I'll put it out there. It's impossible.
Right.
Because there's that much. I mean, you've done a lot of study on this. How many laws are passed every year by the state legislatures?
Oh, by the legislatures, it's, in the hundreds. By Congress, they create dozens of new crimes every year. In fact, the Congressional Research Service, I believe it was a few years ago, tried to research how many crimes exist just in federal law, and they could not even figure out how many, Congress could not even figure out how many how many crimes Congress had created. So it's definitely a problem.
And James Madison, by the way, saw this coming. In Federalist 62, he said, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. He says that's the problem. So
connect us back to the point of silence is consent. We have all these crazy laws. Someone can still object to some of the laws they know about, right?
Yeah, and do they know? Is there a public hearing that's going to be taking place? Oh, look, well, we published a notice in the paper or wherever.
What's a paper?
Right, back when there was a newspaper. Here's the legal notices. Sometimes government will go to meet that minimum requirement of, well, we said that we were going to be doing this.
Sure,
but where's the venue where your voice can be heard?
Another problem I have with this argument that silence constitutes consent is that people often don't revolt for fear of consequences. I mean, you look at, whistleblower persecutions and tax evaders. You look at Irwin Schiff, poor old guy who was a tax evader, chained to a bed in jail and wasted away and died, just for considering taxation to be theft. He was trying to dissent, and the state killed him for it, right? This fear of repercussion does not constitute consent. These individuals, Irwin Schiff did not yield his mind to being oppressively taxed or taxed in a way that he thought was illegitimate or unconstitutional. He wasn't yielding the mind. You look at oppressive regimes that do polling, right, or independent organizations who do polling in these repressive regimes, and what they find in some cases is that these despots have the passive acceptance of their people. Sometimes it's just in the sense that they don't actively revolt. Okay, well, our dear leader in North Korea must surely be supported because people are going along with it. They're not speaking out. They're not revolting. But what about those who do revolt? I mean, does the state suddenly relinquish authority over them, right? Like when Edward Snowden says, I dissent to, having everyone being spied on or whatever, right? Does the state say, oh, okay, we won't spy on you because you spoke up, but all the rest of you who are silent, you're still giving consent, so we're going to continue to spy on you. Even when people are not silent and are clearly dissenting or not yielding the mind, the state does not change its approach when it comes to those people.
So here's a question that I would ask everybody to, in their own way, consider. And that is, would I know whether government, and I mean at any level, is operating with or without my consent? I'm not going to try to answer it for you, but if a person asks themselves that question, that's the first step towards recognizing that simply standing on a piece of ground and breathing air does not necessarily mean consent. Silence doesn't necessarily mean consent. Voting doesn't necessarily mean consent. And I guess the thing I'm really asking you to consider, if you can give your consent, can you not withdraw your consent when necessary?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the example of the trash and the neighbor or the rapist, I mean, if there's no meaningful opportunity to revoke your consent, to change your mind, then you haven't yielded it. If you cannot choose between two options, you don't have the agency to distinguish from one side or the other. You have no ability to rationally and individually say yes to something unless you can say no to it as well.
And that's when the social contract starts to sound more like a suicide pact.
That's potent. That's interesting. All right, well, obviously we can't end a show talking about how depressing and awful the social contract is, right? Because importantly, this is an argument that we will encounter so many times. It's one that's reused, rehashed, and often by people who just haven't really chewed through the meat that we've been offering up here. They haven't really thought about those things. They haven't thought through the consequences or the logical extension of the very argument that they're using that they just heard on Facebook somewhere. And so when you think about the social contract, we have to rebut those arguments, but we have to actually come up with an alternative. We have to come up, not just say no, no, no. We have to say yes to something. And so, Bryan, when you look at that, when you say social contract is the means by which all this, awful government, this tyranny is justified, what do we say to people? Say, okay, I get it. You don't like the social contract. Well, then what do you propose?
Okay, this is the bright, shiny part. Here's where we're going to take it back into the sunlight. What that means is that you and I have the ultimate power to choose when and where we will consent. Now, look, we're taught our whole lives, we're conditioned our whole lives to believe, oh, no, unless there's an authority figure standing nearby for you to ask for permission to either consent or not consent, you don't get to make that choice. But I'm telling you, and I think, Connor, you'd back me up on this, a free person makes that choice. The founders, when they withdrew their consent from the king, didn't wait for the king to give them permission to withdraw that consent. They recognized the need. They believed in the moral foundations of their cause. And they took that permission to themselves, as free men have throughout history. And I'm just going to suggest that if you want to live like a free person, that's the kind of spirit and the kind of fire that needs to be burning in your heart.
I'm going to save most of what I'm going to say here for a future episode because I have someone in mind who I want to interview and expound on this a little bit more. But I like that answer. Part of me feels, Bryan, that it's not practical isn't the right word, but it's not like, how do we implement that? How do we actually achieve that? How do we logistically, go about doing what you said? And as I've tried to think about this, you have to basically replace a system of government because the Declaration itself says that, just government cannot exist without consent of the governed. And then later on came the Constitution that set up a government, on top of these state governments, none of which had consent of the governed. It's all majoritarian rule. But more importantly, it's not that majoritarian rule is bad. 51% over 49% can be bad. But if everyone has explicitly agreed to abide by whatever the majority says, then it's fine because you've at the outset given your consent. Our challenge, the defect in government today is that opportunity to consent does not exist. And so all the implied consent that follows is not actually consent. No one's yielded their mind. And so as I think about it, and I'm only going to touch on this lightly, unfortunately, so I'll leave our listeners hanging a little bit here with what I'm going to mention at least, is a moment ago we talked about, the apple and the orange and the gun to the head, right? If you've got a gun to your head and it's, hey, you will live in this government or you'll move somewhere else, that's not a meaningful choice. We can't have people uprooting their entire lives in order to find a proportionately freer government 200 miles away or 2,000 miles away. If you have to abandon your family and quit your job and separate yourself from your support structure and the land that's been in your family for 100 years, that's not a meaningful decision to make to revoke consent or to dissent. And so what we need, what government has to do, I think, in order to actually have consent of the governed, is to operate in an environment in which there's meaningful choice that doesn't require someone uprooting their entire life. And what that means, I think, is that government cannot be geographically associated anymore. It cannot be that the state of Texas has these boundaries and the state of Oklahoma has jurisdiction over this space, these arbitrary lines on a map. What has to happen is that government has to become, like the Boy Scouts, or it has to become like whatever fraternal organization or insurance company or internet or cable company where you have options to choose from. You live wherever you want, and then different governments operating in the same area compete for your affiliation. And as anybody knows, in competition, prices go down and quality goes up. They're going to have to justify the expense. Maybe some government, like insurance, will be the bare bones minimum. We'll provide police protection, and that's it. Maybe some will add in healthcare and fire and trash and all this other stuff. And you say, hey, well, that's worth the money. Here, I'm going to consent to that. We have to get away from this notion that government has inherent jurisdiction over areas of territory in which anyone who lives there or remains there is subject to that entire notion of jurisdiction and geographically bound governments completely undermines this argument that the government has consent, because every day we're getting newly born people in this environment who don't have any opportunity to consent.
No, they had no say over where or when they were born.
Precisely. And so we have to get away from this idea. That is such a radical departure from what we have today. And I have a guest in mind that we'll save for a future episode to talk about this a little bit more. But as I've thought about this a lot, I think that's the only meaningful way that you can actually give consent, is to be able to dissent, as we've said, and not have to leave everything. That's not meaningful. It's not fair. It's not rational to say that, well, unless you leave your job, leave your family, leave your support structure, you're consenting. No, that's not yielding the mind. That's just the least awful option.
I like the idea. And as long as you have the ability under these competing systems of government to not consent, then you really do have that choice. I mean, it would give a whole new meaning to the phrase free market.
Absolutely. Well, at least we can dream of that day. For now, we'll see you guys on the next episode. societyandthestate.com/18 is the show notes page for today. Be sure you are subscribed, because we have some awesome guests coming up, including in the next episode, we will be talking to Larry Reed, president of the Foundation for Economics Education. He has an awesome new book out. If you do not know who Larry Reed is, you will want to hear this episode. It's such a positive outlook on the cause of liberty. Join us next time, and we'll see you then.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.